We are in the book of First Kings, and we're going to be spending a few weeks on the life of Elijah. Now, here's what's amazing. When Maria and I were talking in December about January, because when you're planning church life, you often kind of don't think beyond Christmas when it's December. And, we talked about some options, and I felt called last week to the life of Elijah. And this week, I'm going to be in 1 Kings 17. And what's amazing is that if you look at the words to the songs we sang, you would think that she knew this. But she didn't. God just speaks to her, apparently. So, why would we study Elijah? And we're going to walk through this passage verse by verse by verse. I mean, the part of the reason that we want to look at the life of Elijah is that in that time, God's people were always surrounded by other countries, other faiths, and there was an ongoing question of how do we relate to that? And let's agree, I think we will, that knowing how to relate to somebody who doesn't believe like you do can be hard. I think we know that if we have a neighbor who's an atheist, the best way to approach it is not to go next door and say, "You're going to hell, can I borrow your lawnmower?" We know that somehow we're supposed to relate to people who don't see the world the way we do, in love and grace, but also truth. I mean, Israel was sent into the promised land to conquer, but that's the only time that go conquer them is really the approach. God often told his people, go in there and tell them, be a blessing to them. In fact, you think about it, when God's people were in Egypt, could God have said, you know what, I'm going to use you to overturn Pharaoh? Yeah, he could have. But God said to them, I want you to leave. When Jonah went to Nineveh, I mean, it's clear that that God was saying, their sin has risen up, and I'm aware of their sin, and I want you to go. And Jonah says, I wanted you to punish them. And God says, no, I want you to call them to repentance. And even Jesus, even though the Romans were basically enslaving God's people, Jesus doesn't overthrow them. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. So how do we do that? And this situation in 1 Kings 17, 18, and 19, because Elijah really is not in the Bible very long. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4 pages, and he's gone. But that was a time, and we talked about this last week, that there was a king who was really bad. Ahab was doing all these things that went against the will of God and the command of God, and he married a woman who, Jezebel is not something we name our daughters, because that's a Jezebel, that's like an insult. And in fact, we looked at the fact last week that Ahab is said to be, he did more evil than all the kings before him. And I studied the Hebrew on that, and I really wanted clarity. Is it saying he was worse than any one of them? No, it appears to say he's worse than all of them put together. And if you read 1 Kings and the kind of litany of these kings, you're like, wow, they were bad. And then he's worse than all of them put together. But in 1 Kings 17, this is what we see. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead. Now wait, doesn't that sound a little funny? Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe. Doesn't that sound odd? It's like, Dan Oldenkamp, the Iowan from Iowa. You're like, why do you need to say both those things? Now, in that case, it's because it's such a positive thing, to be an Iowan. But it doesn't make sense to say that twice. And what we know from the way that language worked in those days, that's something that you want to emphasize. Apparently, the author of this book wants us to know this guy's from Tishbe and it matters. Now, where was Tishbe? We don't really know. There are theories, but we do know enough to know that Tishbe was not a significant enough town to have any record of it, really. We know that it's a little tiny, scrawny little town, like, since we're using Dan, like Sanborn, Iowa. It's a little tiny town. And so we are told right away, this Elijah is not anybody from any place. He's just a guy. In fact, the word Tishbite is sometimes used to refer to like wandering people from nowhere. It's almost like hillbilly or homeless guy or wandering nomad. So all of a sudden, in this list of kings, in 1 Kings 15 and 16, now we say, and by the way, there was this guy Elijah, but he wasn't anybody from anywhere. That matters a lot. So he comes to the king, which also tells us that apparently this Tishbite from Tishbe has kind of gotten some influence, because he's standing before the king and he says, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. And then the word of the Lord comes to Elijah. Now, do you notice that that's backwards? It doesn't say the word of the Lord came to Elijah and the word of the Lord said, go and confront the king. It says he is standing before the king as the representative of God before he gets a specific call. And that's a little scary, honestly. But what we find is that very often the decision to follow God and obey God will come before the specifics. Like, I always joke about the fact that if somebody comes to me and says, hey, will you do me a favor? I want to say, that depends, what is it? Because to say I'll do you a favor when I don't know what that is a little dangerous, isn't it? But he comes before Ahab before the word of the Lord really directs him. Because we'll see that. In fact, God speaking usually comes after you step out in faith. We see this in Joshua 3, when they're coming to the Jordan River and the priests are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and it's flood stage, which means it's not just like, oh, I'm going to wade through up to my ankles or my knees. It's flood stage. And what we see is that they step into the river at God's command, and the river doesn't clear out until they step in. That's scary, isn't it? They haven't been told, okay, go there and stand by the side and throw a rock in the river and it'll stop and then you can walk through. God says, step in. That's scary. But we see over and over and over again that God calls his people to obey before he tells them what to do. Now, the logical question is, how did he know to say this? He says to Ahab, there will be neither dew nor rain except at my word in the next few years. He's not saying, oh, a couple weeks of drought. He's saying for the next few years. The word there means at least 2, maybe more. How did he know to say that? Well, we don't know for sure exactly, but we know the following. We know that he had apparently been seeking God, that he had enough status to speak, and one of the things that I think is consistent when God speaks through people is that if God always calls you to what you think he should call you to, it's probably not God. If you always hear God saying, do this or be this kind of person, and you think, yeah, that makes sense to me, that's what I want to do, that's what I think should happen, then it's probably not God. Because in the Bible, over and over and over and over again, we see God saying, obey me, do this, and we see God's people saying, I'm not sure I like that. Even Jesus in the garden is saying to the Father, if there's another way. Later in the book of Joshua, we already talked about chapter 3. They stepped into the river. In Joshua 6, they come to Jericho, this huge, monstrous fortress. And God says, okay, you're my people. Here's the plan. And they're probably going, okay, we got to write this down, to know the military plans. Where do we put the soldiers? How do we do this? And God says, march around it and play your trumpets. And even though the Bible doesn't tell us, that somebody said, and when do we conquer them? I mean, what do we do when they're mocking us and laughing at us? That doesn't make sense. So part of what we know here is that if God always says what you think he should say, what you expect him to say, it's probably not God you're listening to. So anyway, this is what God says after Elijah has talked to Ahab. He says, "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there." So the birds are going to fly down and feed him. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. And that's kind of obvious, isn't it? I mean, he just went to the king and said, there will be rain. Nope. Dew. Nope. It's going to be bone dry. And God then sends him to live by a little creek, not a river, a brook. And then you can imagine this. Brooks don't dry up overnight. There would have been water flowing down, and day after day after day, we don't know for sure how long, the brook gets less and less and less. You ever feel that way? Physically or emotionally or spiritually or financially, you feel like it's running out here. What's going on? I mean, Elijah had to have some conversations with God where he said, God, you sent me here. This was your command. And the brook's getting less and less and less. And one of the lessons we learn here, and the Bible tells us that over and over again, God will provide what you need if you're where he called you. So the process of learning to trust God starts with saying, God, I trust you. And then God says, okay, do this. Go here. Be this kind of person. And then God supplies, even though we don't necessarily see it. In fact, when we talk about God's will and trusting God, we so often focus on what are we supposed to do. I mean, Levi just got back. He's been visiting colleges, and I have had this conversation with literally dozens, maybe hundreds of high school students who are like, they're a senior, and they're saying, where do I go to school? Where does God want me to go? Or young people who are considering getting married, and they're like, is this the right person? And usually God's direction, God's will, doesn't get that specific. Like, I've been through the whole book. It never says, go to college in Sioux Center, Iowa. It doesn't say any of that. Doesn't even mention Grand Rapids, surprisingly. You know, it doesn't say that. God's will is usually what kind of people we should be. So when we say to God, God, I will follow you. I want to be faithful and I want to trust you. What do you want me to do? And we expect kind of marching orders, and God says, love people, care about people, serve people. Micah 6:8 says, He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. Now, that doesn't mean that God will always give us everything we think we need. I mean, I love the fact that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, faced with the fiery furnace, they say, our God is able to deliver us. They have decided already they're going to follow God. Our God is able to deliver us, but even if He doesn't. I've had the privilege to meet and talk with and sometimes hear stories about people in countries all over the world who have been faithful to God. And they have trusted God to survive and to provide. And sometimes God has taken them home. Sometimes God says, I'm not going to take this disease away because I want to show my strength in your weakness. So verse 8 says, the word of the Lord came to him. I mean, there's this trust thing going on where Elijah goes to Ahab. And then the word of the Lord says, Elijah, go to this. And the water runs out. But God is still there with him. He's learning to trust. And God says, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Now, you need to know that to none of us does this seem shocking. But to them and to Elijah, this would have been like, what? Excuse me, God, let me clear out my ear because I must have heard you wrong. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon. Now, you know who was from Sidon? Jezebel, the queen, who was working against God's people. In fact, Jezebel was kind of not out of the ordinary there. They were heretics. They were they were haters of Yahweh. And so God says, go to the wrong place. It's kind of like the Good Samaritan thing where, people would have heard this story and said, Jesus, Samaritans are not the heroes. And Elijah would have said, God, Sidon? Really? And the key here is to understand that through all of this, we see that God uses whoever He wants to use. And sometimes it's not the person we would think. I mean, Sidon was the wrong place. Samaria was the wrong place. Elijah was from an unimportant, nowhere out of the way place. John the Baptist later was the wrong kind of person. I mean, he was wearing camel's hair, and he was eating bugs. I mean, honestly, if when I had interviewed at this church and I met with the team, and if they had said, oh, here's some cookies and donuts, and I said, no thanks, I brought my cockroaches to eat already. You want some? I would not be preaching here now. Because that's the wrong kind of person, isn't it? I mean, even Jesus and his disciples, Jesus, people say, oh, he's from Nazareth. And I think it's Peter that says, oh, can anything good come out of Nazareth? God uses unlikely people. This should affect our view of God's work several ways. One is it should widen our view of who God can use and who God will use. Samuel in 1 Samuel goes to anoint the new king, and he sees David's oldest brother, Eliab. And Eliab is apparently strong and tall and handsome. And Samuel thinks, oh, this must be the next king. And God says, no, don't consider his height. Because I think the Hebrew actually says, I love short people. But I don't know that. Wayne's not shaking, no. Okay, but the point is, God says, I will use whom I will use. And that should change our view of other people, but also our view of ourselves. Some of us are at a point in our life where we're like, my health is not what it was. I don't have enough money to be handsome, to be successful or significant. I have this sin in my life that has really left me disqualified. And God consistently uses people like you. In fact, in this case, God says, go to Sidon, and there's a woman. Come on, in that day, women weren't able to own property. God, over and over and over again, lifts up women and says, you know, women, you may have been made to feel like second-class citizens, but you matter to me, and I will use you. And it's not only a woman, but it's a poor widow. And in those days, poor widows were throwaway things. And God says, don't worry about that. I will use her. It's like if God said to you, okay, I have a plan for you. I wanted you to get on the train and go to inner city Detroit and get off the train, and there's going to be a homeless guy sitting there. He's the answer. And you're like, no. So he went to Zarephath. And when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, will you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? She was going to get it. He called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. Do you hear that? We're starving to death. Whoever you are, apparently she knows he's a follower of God. I'm starving to death. I just have a little bit of food. And Elijah says, well, feed me first. Wow. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. She went away and did as Elijah had told her, so there was food every day for Elijah and the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. You see what's happening here? There's this crazy, shocking, mutual salvation going on. Elijah needs a place to go. He needs food. And this unlikely, impossible woman who actually needs just as much help herself. She's in great need. Elijah is in great need. But they are both totally dependent on God to be adequate for the task. She's not even a follower of Yahweh. See, God does not act the way we want him to. Let's go on. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and finally stopped breathing. Now, we hear later that she has her son in her arms. So we know he's not even full grown. Maybe at the most, he's 10. She's holding her son as he dies. And then she looks at Elijah and she says, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Is there any more pitiful sight than this widow holding her child? And I mean, some of us have been there. Maybe you've even lost your child, or you've had somebody that you loved that lost their child. But she also, notice this, she says, "Did you come to remind me of my sin?" She's not saying, "I've lived a perfect, wonderful life." She's saying, "Yeah, I know I'm a sinner. Is that why my son is dying?" "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" She again he's asking the same question. Say, "God, why are you doing this?" He's saying, "This is not what I think you should do, God. This is not what I want you to be? Now, notice that God does not scold him or smite him for asking the question. Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried to the Lord, Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. You see, Elijah has come to the point where he has learned to trust God. He stood before Ahab, and he risked his life by confronting the king. He went to this brook in the wilderness, and he trusted God, and God provided water and food brought by the ravens. And then the water ran out, and Elijah was given a new word by God. And Elijah trusts him. And that Elijah, who has learned to trust God because of God's faithfulness, calls out to God and says, do a miracle. And God does. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, look, your son is alive. Enter into that woman's heart for a moment, at that moment. She says, I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Now, there's a subtle question here that is both subtle and screaming. Why did God raise this boy? I mean, this woman says, did my son die because I'm a sinner? She knows she's right. She accepts the fact that she's a sinner. But look back at verse 21. He stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried to the Lord, let his life return. Literally, Elijah is asking, he's doing something that was common and is to this day common. You drape yourself over a dead person, and you are really symbolically saying, God, take me instead. But God doesn't take Elijah instead. The woman is saying, is my son dying for my sin? Elijah is saying, take me instead. Let me die for this boy. And God doesn't accept that. The word stretch there, and I've struggled with how far to take this. That's the same word that was used when Jesus told Peter in John 21, there will come a day when you will be stretched out, meaning you will die. And so Elijah is saying, take me. I will choose to die for this boy. His mom couldn't die for him. Elijah couldn't die for him. But anybody in Jesus' day would have read this and said, oh, someone will stretch out and will pay for the sin of the people. I mean, this points ahead to Jesus and says, we should offer ourselves. We should face our own sin. But ultimately, we can't stretch out ourselves for someone else's sin. Only God the Father can offer his Son. So what? Real quick. Number one, I would challenge you to step out in trust. Be willing to say, okay, I don't know what God's calling me to, but I will do it. Step out in trust. Secondly, let God transform your anthropology. What I mean by that is let God change the way you view people. You might think, well, God doesn't use poor people or this kind of person or this kind of person or people like me. God says, I will use whom I will use. And then finally, trust God to be the God who is there. What do I mean by that? Well, this little boy has died. They call out to God, and God is there. We sang it earlier. You have been our fourth man in the fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace were not alone. God was with them. God is the one you can cry out to. He's the one who can bring life. And so one of the things we learn from Elijah in this case is, I'm hungry, I'm in need, I'm broken, I'm lost, everything is difficult, and God says, I am with